The Price of Stardom. Carole Landis meets Darryl Zanuck. Book 5 of the Ethereal Hollywood series. By Arnold Kalnitsky. Preface. Ethereal Hollywood is a world reconfigured from the golden age of Hollywood, where the legendary stars are not just memories, but immortal archetypes, still living in their own parallel alternative reality. Familiar history is not duplicated but flexible and constantly revisioning itself along diverse pathways. Time and space are also more fluid and less binding. And what has been called magic works in odd and unusual ways, producing scenarios from the silly to the surreal. And since these stories are in an alternative world dimension, there are variances from real-world facts, such as the relationship between characters, studios, events. This is a fluid world where history flows in unexpected directions. These are audiobooks with imagery synced to the narrative as much as possible, serving as quasi-storyboards to give a rough visual dimension to the stories. The screen door slapped shut behind Carole, the sound sharp in the quiet morning air. She stood on the porch of her bungalow, squinting against the glare bouncing off her neighbor's chrome bumper. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. It was cheap leather, already peeling at the edges. She'd bought it for her first audition. Inside, the smell of stale coffee hung thick. Carole ignored the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen table. She walked straight to the mirror above the sink. Her reflection stared back, blonde hair slightly frizzed from the humidity. She smoothed it down with a damp palm. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper today. She practiced a smile, white and bright like the girls in the magazines. It felt stiff. The bus ride to Fox was crowded and hot. Carole pressed her forehead against the cool window glass. She watched the studio gates loom into view, massive and imposing. Guards in crisp uniforms waved cars through. Her stomach knotted. She adjusted the collar of her dress, a simple blue cotton thing she hoped looked professional. Her heels clicked on the pavement as she stepped off the bus, joining the stream of hopefuls and secretaries flowing toward the soundstages. Darryl F. Zanuck's outer office was hushed and cool. Carole perched on the edge of a plush sofa, clutching her portfolio. Her palms were damp. She watched the secretary behind the big desk, her movements efficient, her own blonde hair perfectly lacquered. Carole glanced down at her own shoes. One scuff mark, faint but there, marred the toe. She tucked her foot back, out of sight. The heavy oak door to the inner office opened. Zanuck stood there, cigar smoke curling around him. He didn't smile. "Miss Landis," he said, his voice flat. "Come in." His office smelled of leather and expensive tobacco. Trophies and framed posters lined the walls. Sonia Henney on ice, Alice Faye singing, Betty Grable's $1 Million Legs. Zanuck settled behind his vast desk, gesturing vaguely at the chair opposite. He didn't look at her portfolio. "You want to be one of them?" he asked, his gaze sweeping towards the posters. "The blondes." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You've got the look. Sort of. Raw." Carole's throat tightened. "I can work hard, Mr. Zanuck. I learn lines fast. I'll do anything," he cut her off with a wave of his cigar. "That's just it, honey." His eyes, small and shrewd, locked onto hers. "Anything." He let the word hang, heavy in the quiet room. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips, devoid of warmth. "See, talent's cheap. Ambition, plentiful. What makes a fox blonde?" He pushed his chair back and stood, pacing behind the desk. His shadow fell over Sonia Henney's frozen smile. "It's about loyalty. Investment." He stopped, turning to face her fully. "You want a starring role. A contract that puts your face on billboards." He leaned forward, palms flat on the polished wood. "Then you invest in me. Personally." The implication landed like a stone. "Discreetly, of course. Consider it professional development." Carole's hand tensed where she gripped the portfolio. The peeling leather felt suddenly pathetic. The posters seemed to leer down at her, Betty's legs, Alice's smile, June's perfect teeth. All bought. All paid. Her stomach churned. She forced herself to meet his gaze. I just want a fair chance. To prove myself. Her voice sounded thin, reedy. Zanuck chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He tapped ash into a crystal tray. Fair. He shook his head. This town eats fair for breakfast, sweetheart. You got raw material. I polish it. But Polish costs. He settled back into his chair, the leather sighing. Take a day. Think it over. The door only opens once. He picked up a script, dismissing her without another glance. The air conditioning hummed, suddenly icy against her skin. Portfolio slipping slightly in her damp grip. She mumbled something, thanks, maybe, and stumbled towards the heavy door. The secretary didn't look up. Outside, the bright California sun felt like an assault after the dim, smoky office. She blinked, the images of the Fox blondes burning behind her eyelids. Betty Grable's legs. Alice Faye's smile. Polished. Paid for. She walked blindly, the manicured studio lawns blurring. A group of chorus girls in identical costumes giggled past, their voices sharp and bright. One of them glanced at Carole, her gaze lingering on the cheap dress, the scuffed shoe. Carole flinched, pulling her shoulders back. The scent of orange blossoms from a nearby tree was suddenly cloying, sickly sweet. Her stomach clenched again, a hard knot of revulsion and something else, a cold, desperate calculation. Reaching her tiny dressing room, shared with 3 others, Carole shut the door and leaned against it. The silence pressed in. She stared at her reflection in the cracked vanity mirror. The wide, practiced smile she'd rehearsed that morning was gone. Her face looked pale, hollow. Professional development. The words echoed, ugly and stark. She traced the peeling edge of her handbag strap with a trembling finger. Outside, a director's voice barked orders. The sound of ambition, loud and relentless. She sank onto the stiff wooden chair, the portfolio falling open on her lap. Inside were headshots, hopeful, bright-eyed, and clippings of her bit parts. Waitress number 3, cigarette girl. She flipped past them to a worn magazine page featuring Betty Grable, radiant in a Technicolor musical. The gloss felt cold under her touch. Was that the price? Not just sweat and missed meals, but that. A sour taste filled her mouth. She thought of her mother back in Wisconsin, saving pennies from her seamstress job to send Carole a birthday card. A sharp knock rattled the door. Landis, you're needed on stage 4. Crowd scene, 10 minutes. The assistant's voice was impersonal, hurried. Carole flinched, snapping the portfolio shut. Stage 4. Another faceless role in the background. She stood, smoothing her cheap blue dress, her fingers lingering over the fabric. The scuff on her shoe seemed to glare up at her. She took a deep breath, the air thick with dust and hairspray. The door only opens once, he'd said. Grabbing her script, she stepped back into the fluorescent-lit corridor. The bustle of the studio surrounded her, grips hauling scenery, extras chattering, the distant thump of a dance number. She walked towards stage 4, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the linoleum. Passing an open door, she glimpsed Sonia Henney. Practicing a spin on a fake ice rink, effortless and graceful under the hot lights. Carole's jaw tightened. She didn't look away. A cold resolve settled over her, sharp and brittle as glass. The crowd scene was chaos, 100 extras packed into a mock nightclub, sweating under the glare of Klieg lights. Carole was shoved to the back, behind a potted palm. She watched the lead actress, a fox blonde she didn't recognize, deliver a line with practiced charm. The director yelled, "Cut!" And the blonde laughed, tossing her perfect hair. Carole's fingers dug into her palms. The scent of sweat and cheek powder filled the air. She closed her eyes for a second, Zanuck's words echoing, investment. Polish costs. Asterisk. Later, alone in the communal dressing room, she stared at the cracked mirror again. The cheap blue dress hung limply on a hook. She touched her reflection, tracing the faint lines beside her eyes. Then, deliberately, she picked up the studio phone. Her hand trembled only slightly as she dialed the extension she'd memorized. "Mr. Zanuck's office, please," she said, her voice low and surprisingly steady. The receiver felt heavy, cold against her ear. The pause stretched, filled with the hum of the line. Outside, the studio whistle blew, signaling the end of the day. Carole watched dust motes dance in a shaft of dying sunlight. She didn't look away from her own reflection. Her eyes held a new, hard glint. "Yes," she said into the silence, the word clear and final. "Tell him Carole Landis is ready to discuss investment." She hung up. The peeling leather handbag lay discarded on the floor. She walked out into the cooling twilight. The manicured paths were emptying, the sound stages falling quiet. Near the commissary, she saw Mitzi Gaynor laughing with a producer, her blonde hair catching the last light. Carole didn't flinch. She kept walking, her steps measured, towards the studio gates. The guard nodded, barely glancing at her. Beyond the wrought iron, the city lights began to flicker on. At her bungalow, she bypassed the kitchen table with its bills. Instead, she went straight to the small closet. She pushed past the simple dresses, the worn sweaters. Her fingers found it, hidden at the back, a dress she'd bought on layaway months ago, deep emerald silk, cut low. She hadn't dared wear it. Not yet. She pulled it out, the fabric cool and heavy. It shimmered faintly in the dim light. She held it against herself, facing the mirror. The cheap blue dress lay crumpled on the bed. "Tomorrow." The word echoed in the silent room. She ran a hand over the silk, feeling its promise, its weight. Outside, a car horn blared. Carole didn't hear it. Her reflection stared back, the practiced smile gone. In its place was something raw, determined, utterly still. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper in the shadows. She turned away, laying the green dress carefully across the only chair. It gleamed like a weapon. The peeling handbag lay where she'd dropped it. She picked it up, opened it, and pulled out the small, dog-eared photo tucked inside, her mother, standing stiffly in front of their Wisconsin porch. Carole traced the worn edges. The scent of coffee and dust filled the small space. She placed the photo back, snapping the clasp shut with finality. The cheap leather felt different now. Insufficient. She kicked off her scuffed heels, the sound loud in the quiet. Sleep wouldn't come. She lay rigid in the dark, listening to the distant hum of Los Angeles. Zanuck's face swam behind her closed eyelids, the cigar smoke, the cold appraisal, the posters of the blondes watching. Investment. The silk dress hung like a ghost in the moonlight filtering through the thin curtains. She thought of the chorus girl's dismissive glance, the director's barked orders. Her hands clenched a thin sheet. A single, hot tear escaped, tracing a path to her pillow. She wiped it away roughly. The first gray light of dawn crept in. Carole rose, moving with a strange, mechanical precision. She bypassed the coffee pot. At the sink, she splashed cold water on her face, the shock sharp. She studied her reflection. The hollow look was still there, but the eyes were changed. Harder. Clearer. She picked up the green silk dress. The fabric whispered as she slipped it on. It fit perfectly. She didn't look at the mirror again. She picked up the cheap handbag, then set it down. Reaching back into the closet, she pulled out a small, beaded evening clutch she'd never used. It felt cool and expensive in her hand. She walked out the door without a backward glance. The studio gates felt different this time. The guard gave her a second look, a flicker of surprise crossing his face as he waved her through. She walked the manicured paths, the emerald silk catching the early sun. Heads turned. Whispers trailed her, a low hum of curiosity. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, her chin lifted. The scent of orange blossoms was faint now, overpowered by the sharp tang of fresh paint from a nearby set. She felt the stares like physical touches, but she didn't flinch. Her heels clicked a steady, deliberate rhythm on the pavement. She didn't go to her dressing room. Instead, she walked straight to the executive building. The secretary behind the desk in Zanuck's outer office looked up, her perfectly lacquered blonde hair gleaming. Her eyes widened slightly at the green silk, the unfamiliar clutch. She opened her mouth, perhaps to ask for an appointment. Carole didn't stop. She walked past the plush sofa, past the startled secretary, and pushed open the heavy oak door to Zanuck's inner office without knocking. The scent of leather and cigar smoke washed over her. Zanuck was at his desk, reading a script. He looked up, startled, cigar poised halfway to his lips. His shrewd eyes took her in, the green silk, the defiant posture, the unfamiliar hardness in her face. A slow, appreciative smile spread across his features, colder than the morning air. He leaned back, gesturing expansively at the chair opposite him with his cigar. Well, he drawled, the smoke curling around his words. Looks like someone decided to make a down payment. Carole didn't sit. She stood before his desk, the emerald dress shimmering under the office lights, feeling less like armor and more like a target pinned to her chest. The posters of the Fox blondes seemed to watch, their frozen smiles suddenly predatory. She met his gaze, her voice low and unnervingly steady. Terms, she stated, the single word cutting through the haze of smoke. Discreet, limited duration, and a signed contract for a leading role, effective immediately upon completion. She squeezed the beaded clutch firmly. Zanuck chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. He tapped ash into the crystal tray, his eyes never leaving hers. Bold, he murmured. I like bold. He pushed a single sheet of paper across the vast expanse of polished wood. It was a standard Fox contract, but scrawled across the top in thick blue pencil were the words, starring role, TBD. He held out a fountain pen, its gold nib gleaming. Sign now, sweetheart. Consider it your first act of faith. The silence stretched, thick with the scent of leather and impending ruin. Carole stared at the blue pencil scrawl, the flimsy promise of everything she'd wanted. The clutch felt slick in her hand. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the pen. The eyes of the blondes bored into her back. She picked it up. The nib hovered over the line. She signed. The ink flowed dark and irrevocable, Carole Landis. The scratch of the pen was the loudest sound in the room. Zanuck watched, a satisfied predator, as she set it down. Smart girl, he purred, leaning back. My driver will collect you tonight. 9 sharp. The Beverly Wilshire. Suite 1204. Don't be late. He picked up his script again, dismissal absolute. The transaction was complete. Carole walked out, the green silk suddenly heavy, constricting. The secretary's gaze followed her, wide-eyed and knowing. Outside, the studio lot was waking up. A grip whistled appreciatively at her dress. She didn't react, walking stiffly towards the sound stages, the signed contract burning a hole in her clutch. Stage 4 again. Another crowd scene. She took her place behind the potted palm, the emerald silk absurdly bright against the fake foliage. The Klieg lights came on, blindingly hot. She closed her eyes. 9 sharp. The Beverly Wilshire. The countdown had begun. At lunch, she avoided the mirror. She changed back into her cheap blue dress, folding the green silk with numb fingers. The beaded clutch lay beside it, a gaudy accusation. The studio commissary buzzed with chatter, but she sat alone, pushing food around her plate. Across the room, she saw Mitzi Gaynor, radiant and oblivious, signing an autograph. Carole's stomach clenched. She shoved the plate away. The taste of ashes filled her mouth. She had signed. She had agreed. The polished future stretched before her, bright and utterly tarnished. The afternoon dragged. On stage 4, the director yelled, "Action!" Carole stood motionless behind the palm, a prop among props. The lead actress flubbed her line, giggling. Cut. Again. The Klieg lights beat down, hot and relentless. Sweat trickled down Carole's spine beneath the thin cotton. She thought of the Beverly Wilshire. Suite 1204. The cold precision of Zanuck's instructions. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, trembled. She pressed them flat against her thighs, forcing stillness. The scent of overheated bulbs and dust was suffocating. At 6, the whistle blew. Carole walked the emptying lot, the setting sun painting the sound stages in long, distorted shadows. The guard at the gate tipped his hat, his eyes lingering on her face. She ignored him, stepping onto the bus. It was less crowded now. She took a window seat, pressing her forehead to the cool glass. The city blurred past, neon signs flickering on, palm trees silhouetted against the dying light. Each block felt like a mile marker towards the inevitable. She closed her eyes, but saw only Zanuck's slow, cold smile. Back in the bungalow, silence screamed. She didn't turn on the lights. The green dress lay waiting, a shimmering pool on the chair. She ran a bath, the water scalding. Steam filled the tiny bathroom, clouding the mirror. She sank into the water, submerging herself until her lungs burned. When she surfaced, gasping, the steam had cleared slightly. Her reflection stared back, pale, wet, the hard glint in her eyes now mixed with a raw, naked fear. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 7:30. Time was a tightening noose. She dried off with rough, hurried motions. The silk slithered over her skin, cool and alien. She fastened the tiny hooks with trembling fingers. In the dimness, the dress looked darker, almost black. She applied makeup with clinical precision. Red lips, arched brows, powder to mask the pallor. The final touch was Zanuck's pen, tucked into the beaded clutch. A reminder. A weapon. She didn't know. Outside, a car engine purred to a stop. Headlights cut through the thin curtains. 9 sharp. He was early. The chauffeur was stone-faced, holding the door of the sleek black Cadillac. The leather seat was cold. Carole watched her neighborhood blur past, the peeling paint, the sagging porches, the life she was leaving behind. The city lights grew brighter, denser. The Beverly Wilshire loomed, a fortress of polished brass and marble. The chauffeur opened her door without a word. The lobby was hushed, opulent. Bellhops in crisp uniforms eyed her silk dress. She walked straight to the elevator, the click of her borrowed heels echoing like gunshots in the plush silence. Suite 1204. The door was a slab of dark wood. She raised a hand to knock, then stopped. Her breath hitched. Behind that door lay the polished future, the starring role, the ruin. She saw her mother's face, the scuffed shoe, the chorus girl's dismissive glance. Her fingers curled into fists. Then, deliberately, she smoothed the silk over her hips, lifted her chin, and pressed the bell. The chime sounded distant, final. Somewhere inside, footsteps approached the door. The lock clicked. Zanuck stood there, silhouetted against the soft glow of a table lamp. He wore a silk robe, cigar smoke curling around him like a shroud. His eyes swept over her, lingering on the emerald dress, the red lips. Punctual, he murmured, stepping aside. The suite was vast, all low lights and deep carpets, a bottle of champagne sweating in a silver bucket. He didn't touch her. Not yet. Drink, he offered, pouring without waiting for an answer. The bubbles fizzed, sharp and mocking. She took the crystal flute, her fingers cold against the stem. The champagne tasted sour, metallic. He watched her, that predator's smile playing on his lips as he settled onto a plush sofa. Relax, Carole. This is business. He patted the space beside him. The air hummed with unspoken violation. She didn't move. Her gaze drifted to the window, the glittering sprawl of Los Angeles below. Fox Studios was out there, dark now. Waiting. The silence stretched, thick with the scent of his cigar, her perfume, dread. Then he stood. Closed the distance. His hand, heavy and possessive, settled on her bare shoulder. The silk felt like paper under his touch. She flinched, the champagne sloshing dangerously. His other hand reached for the tiny hook at the nape of her neck. "Let's see the investment," he breathed, his voice a low rasp against her ear. The hook gave way. The dress began to slip. Outside, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. Carole closed her eyes. The contract was signed. The door had opened. She stepped back sharply, the half-unfastened dress gaping. Her voice, when it came, was a shard of ice. "Not here." She gestured towards the bedroom door, a calculated retreat. Zanuck's eyes narrowed, then gleamed with amusement. He liked the fight. He followed, his robe whispering against the thick carpet. The bedroom was cavernous, dominated by a vast bed. She stopped beside it, turning to face him. The fear was a live wire in her chest, but her chin stayed high. "The contract," she said, holding his gaze. "I want it in my hand. Now." He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "After." He reached for her again, his fingers brushing the falling silk. Carole didn't move. Her hand dipped into the beaded clutch resting on the nightstand. She pulled out the fountain pen he'd given her, the one she'd signed with. Its gold nib caught the lamplight. Not a weapon. A symbol. She held it out, point first, towards him. Not a threat. A reminder. "The contract," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "Or this ends. Before it begins." Her eyes, hard and desperate, locked onto his. The polished future hung suspended in the thick, perfumed air. Zanuck's smile vanished. Annoyance flickered across his face, replaced by a cold reassessment. He studied her, the defiance in her stance, the pen trembling only slightly in her outstretched hand. He hadn't expected backbone. Not like this. With a slow, deliberate movement, he turned and walked to a small, locked briefcase beside the bureau. The click of the lock was loud. He pulled out the single sheet, her contract, the blue pencil scrawl stark against the typed clauses. He held it up. "Satisfied?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. Carole kept the pen pointed, her gaze fixed on the paper. "Put it on the dresser," she ordered, the command thin but sharp. He complied, placing it beside a crystal decanter. The moment he stepped back, she snatched it up, folding it once with stiff fingers before shoving it deep into the clutch. The pen followed. Only then did her shoulders relax, a fraction. The green silk pooled lower on her arms. She turned back to face him, the contract secured, the brief illusion of control evaporating. The vast, waiting bed filled her peripheral vision. His eyes, predatory again, roamed over her exposed skin. The transaction demanded completion. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his hand rough now, gripping her bare arm. The scent of his cigar, his cologne, overwhelmed her. He pulled her towards the bed, the silk whispering its surrender. Carole stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the mattress. The city lights outside were a distant, indifferent glitter. She closed her eyes, bracing for the weight, the violation. The polished future was in the clutch on the dresser. The cost was here, now, in this room. His breath was hot against her neck. The contract was signed. The door had opened. She had walked through. There was no turning back. His fingers dug into her skin, possessive and demanding, as he pushed her down onto the cool satin coverlet. The emerald silk snagged, tearing faintly at the shoulder. Carole turned her face away, pressing her cheek into the pillow. It smelled of starch and something faintly floral, artificial. She focused on that smell, on the texture against her skin, anything but the reality of his body above hers, the rasp of his silk robe against her arm. Outside, a siren wailed, distant and mournful. It felt like the only sound in the world besides his breathing, heavy and close. The lamp cast long, distorted shadows on the ceiling, shapes that twisted and merged. Afterwards, he rolled away without a word, reaching for the cigar smoldering on the nightstand. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of tobacco and the frantic drumming of her own heart against her ribs. Carole lay perfectly still, staring at the water stain on the ceiling plaster. The silk dress was a ruin around her waist. She felt cold, hollowed out. The scent of him, of sex and smoke, clung to her skin, cloying and suffocating. She heard the clink of ice as he poured another drink. The polished future felt like ashes in her mouth. The contract was signed. The price was paid. Slowly, mechanically, she sat up, pulling the torn silk up to cover herself. She didn't look at him. Her movements were stiff, automatic, as she retrieved the beaded clutch from the dresser. The contract inside felt like a lead weight. She walked towards the bathroom, her bare feet silent on the deep pile carpet. She closed the door, locking it. The light was harsh, unforgiving. In the mirror, her reflection stared back, smudged makeup, haunted eyes, the ghost of Zanuck's touch on her skin. She turned on the faucet, the water roaring in the sudden silence, and began to scrub. Outside, she heard the clink of glass, the rustle of papers. Then his voice, muffled but clear through the door, "The driver will take you home. Be on set tomorrow, 7 sharp. We start your screen tests next week." No tenderness, no acknowledgement, just business concluded. Carole leaned her forehead against the cool tile, the water still running. She watched it swirl down the drain, carrying flecks of mascara, the last traces of the person she'd been hours ago. She dried her face roughly with a thick monogrammed towel, avoiding her own gaze in the mirror. Dressed again in the ruined green silk, she walked back into the suite. Zanuck was at the desk now, reading a script, robe loosely tied. He didn't look up. The contract was fulfilled. The silence was absolute. She picked up her clutch, her movements deliberate, and walked to the suite door without a word. The corridor outside was empty, hushed. The elevator descended smoothly. In the lobby, the night clerk averted his eyes. The black Cadillac waited at the curb, engine idling. The chauffeur opened the door. She slid in, the leather seat cold against her skin. The city slid past the window, a blur of neon and shadow. She clutched the beaded bag to her chest, feeling the sharp corner of the contract inside. The polished future had begun. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the screen test. Tomorrow, the first step towards becoming a fox blonde. The car turned onto her street, past the sagging porches, the peeling paint. Home. She got out, the silk whispering against the seat. The Cadillac pulled away, leaving her standing alone in the dark. The bungalow door creaked open. Inside, the cheap blue dress lay where she'd left it, a crumpled ghost on the bed. She didn't sleep. She sat at the small kitchen table, the contract laid out under the harsh bulb. The blue pencil scrawl, starring role, TBD, mocked her. She traced the letters, her fingers cold. Outside, the first birds began to chirp. Dawn crept in, gray and indifferent. She rose, moving to the sink. Splashed cold water on her face. The reflection in the smudged mirror was unfamiliar. Hollow-eyed, lips still stained red, the torn shoulder of the green silk gaping. She changed into a plain blouse and skirt, folding the ruined dress with numb hands. It went back into the closet, hidden. The contract went into the bag. Time for work. The studio guard barely glanced at her pass. The manicured paths felt longer today. Whispers seemed to follow her, a low hum she couldn't decipher. She saw Mitzi Gaynor near the commissary, laughing, sunlight catching her hair. Carole looked away, walking faster. Stage 4. Another crowd scene. She took her usual place behind the potted palm, shrinking into the shadows. The Klieg lights blazed. Sweat prickled her skin. The director yelled, "Action!" She stood frozen, a prop. Her mind raced. Screen tests next week. A starring role. The scent of dust and hot bulbs choked her. She closed her eyes. Investment. Polish costs. The words were etched into her bones now. A sharp voice cut through the din. Landis. Carole Landis. A young assistant, clipboard in hand, scanned the crowd. Carole's heart lurched. She stepped out from behind the palm. "Mr. Zanuck wants you," the assistant said, barely masking his curiosity. Screen test building. Now. He turned, expecting her to follow. The crowd scene blurred around her. The lead actress shot her a sharp, questioning look. Carole straightened her cheap blouse, lifted her chin. She walked past the potted palm, past the extras, following the assistant. The polished future was calling. Her heels clicked on the linoleum, a steady, hollow sound echoing down the suddenly silent corridor. The screen test building hummed with a different energy, tense, expectant. Cameras loomed like monoliths. Technicians moved with brisk efficiency. Zanuck wasn't there. Instead, a sharp-eyed director named Peter Fulton gestured her towards a chair bathed in blinding light. Landis. Right. We're testing for a new musical. Knights in White Satin. He tossed her a few pages of script, dense with lyrics and stage. Directions. Learn the marked section. You've got 20 minutes. Wardrobe. A woman appeared, holding a flimsy, sequined costume, a pale imitation of the Fox blonde glamour. Fulton gave Carole a dismissive once-over. Try not to freeze up, sweetheart. Zanuck's expecting results. Alone in the harsh light, the sequined costume scratchy against her skin, Carole stared at the script. The lyrics blurred. Her hands trembled. She thought of the Beverly Wilshire, the tearing silk, the contract burning in her bag. Investment. Polish costs. She closed her eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath. When she opened them, the fear was still there, cold in her gut, but beneath it, a fierce, desperate ember glowed. This was her shot. The only shot. She gripped the script, tightly. She wouldn't freeze. She couldn't. She began to mouth the words, her voice a whisper lost in the cavernous room. Places. Fulton barked. The cameras whirred to life. The Klieg lights were hotter than stage 4, searing. Carole stepped onto the mark, the cheap sequins catching the light garishly. She felt exposed, raw. Fulton gave the signal. She took another breath, deeper this time, filling her lungs. She looked not at the camera, but through it, past the glare, towards the polished future she'd bought. Her voice, when she sang the first line, started thin, wavering. Then it found its core, low, husky, carrying a raw edge of defiance that silenced the bustling crew. She moved, not with Sonia Henney's grace, but with a wounded, burning intensity that held the room utterly still. Fulton leaned forward, his earlier dismissal forgotten. The final note hung in the air, sharp and unfinished. Silence stretched, thick with the hum of the cameras. Fulton didn't yell, cut. He stared, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded once, a curt, professional acknowledgement. Okay. Print that. He turned away, already calling for the next setup, but the technicians exchanged glances. One whispered, "Where'd that come from?" Carole stood trembling in the sudden quiet, the sequined costume suddenly heavy. Sweat trickled down her temple, mingling with the cheap stage powder. The fear was still there, a cold knot, but beneath it pulsed something new, fierce and undeniable. She hadn't just performed, she'd bled onto the screen. Later, back in her shared dressing room, the cheap blue dress felt like sackcloth. The sequined costume lay discarded on a chair, a gaudy chrysalis. She avoided her reflection, scrubbing the heavy makeup from her face with rough cotton pads. The water ran pink. Outside, the studio buzzed with its usual frantic energy, but a different kind of whisper seemed to trail her now, not just curiosity, but a low thrum of speculation. She pulled Zanuck's contract from her bag. The blue pencil scrawl, starring role, TBD, seemed less like a taunt and more like a fragile, blood-stained lifeline. She folded it carefully, her fingers no longer numb. The knock on her door was sharp. It was Fulton's assistant, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Fulton wants to see you." His office. 5 minutes. He didn't wait for a reply. Carole looked at the cheap blue dress, then at the crumpled green silk hidden in her closet. She smoothed her plain blouse, ran damp fingers through her hair, and walked out. Her steps down the corridor were steady, echoing the rhythm she'd found under the blinding lights. The polished future was no longer just a promise signed in desperation, it was a path she had begun to carve with her own fire, paid for in a currency far more complex than Zanuck's vile transaction. The cost was etched deep, but the fight, she realized, had only just ignited. Fulton's office was cramped, filled with script stacks and framed posters. He didn't look up immediately, scribbling notes on a call sheet. When he finally did, his sharp eyes assessed her with none of his earlier dismissal. "Sit," he grunted, pushing a single glossy photograph across the cluttered desk. It was a still from her test, her face caught mid-song, eyes blazing with that raw, defiant intensity. Zanuck saw the dailies, Fulton stated flatly. "He wants you in, Knights in White Satin. Not the lead. Not yet. But the second lead, Lila, the torch singer. It's got bite. Fits, whatever that was." He tapped the photo. "Rehearsals start Monday. Don't be late." And Landis. He met her gaze, a flicker of something almost like respect in his. "Don't lose the edge." The news should have been elating. Instead, Carole felt a cold wave of relief mixed with dread. Lila wasn't a fox blonde ingenue, she was world-weary, sharp-tongued, a survivor. The role was a spotlight, yes, but also a cage shaped by Zanuck's expectations. Leaving Fulton's office, she walked past stage 4. The crowd scene was still filming. The lead actress flubbed another line, giggling nervously. Carole didn't pause. She walked straight to the commissary, ignoring the stares, and bought a strong black coffee. Sitting alone, she unfolded Zanuck's contract. With deliberate, steady strokes, she crossed out TBD and wrote Lila, Knights in White Satin, above his blue scrawl. The ink was dark, definitive. It felt like reclaiming a sliver of her soul. Outside, the California sun beat down, bleaching the manicured lawns. Carole walked towards the exit, the contract a tangible weight in her pocket. She passed Mitzi Gaynor again, radiant in a cloud of pink tulle, surrounded by admirers. This time, Carole didn't look away. She met Mitzi's cheerful gaze for a fleeting second, her own expression unreadable, hardened by secrets and sacrifice. The guard tipped his hat as she passed through the gates. The city sprawled before her, shimmering with mirage-like promise and hidden rot. She hailed a cab, sliding into the worn seat. "Where to, lady?" the driver asked. Carole leaned back, closing her eyes. "Just drive," she murmured. She needed to feel the movement, the distance, before facing the bungalow, the hidden green silk, and the relentless countdown to Monday. The game was truly on. The cab wove through traffic, the meter ticking like a mocking echo of the studio clock. Carole watched the city blur past, the glittering marquees, the sun-bleached stucco, the desperate hopefuls lining casting calls. She thought of Lila, the torch singer. A woman who'd seen too much, sung too many broken-hearted ballads. Was that her shield now? Her armor? She touched the folded contract in her pocket, the ink still damp beneath her fingers where she'd written, Lila. It felt less like a victory and more like stepping onto a minefield, mapped by Zanuck's cold calculations. The cab hit a pothole, jolting her. She opened her eyes, catching the driver's curious glance in the rearview mirror. "Change of plans," she announced, her voice firmer. "Take me to Schwab's. Maybe among the aspirants and the ice cream sodas, she could find a sliver of the girl she'd been before the emerald dress." Schwab's pharmacy was buzzing, thick with the scent of griddle grease and ambition. Starlets perched on stools, dissecting auditions over milkshakes. Screenwriters hunched over coffee, arguing plot points. Carole found a quiet corner booth, the cracked red vinyl cool against her legs. She ordered a black coffee, ignoring the menu. A copy of Variety lay discarded on the table. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the casting notices, the box office reports, the gossip columns. Her fingers stopped, tracing a small item. Zanuck Eye's new project after Satin. Her stomach clenched. The transaction wasn't over, it was merely the first installment. The coffee arrived, bitter and scalding. She took a sip, the heat a grounding shock. Around her, the chatter continued, a symphony of dreams and desperation. She was one of them, yet irrevocably apart, marked by the deal struck in Suite 1204. Setting the cup down with a decisive click, Carole pulled a small notebook and a pencil stub from her bag. Not Zanuck's pen, hers. She opened to a fresh page, the blankness a sudden, terrifying canvas. Then, deliberately, she began to write. Not lines from the script, not lyrics for Lila. She wrote names. Names whispered in dressing rooms, names glimpsed on call sheets, names of men Zanuck used, women he discarded. She wrote locations, discreet bungalows, hotel suites, private clubs mentioned in hushed tones. Her handwriting was small, precise, a stark contrast to the chaos inside. This wasn't revenge, not yet. It was reconnaissance. Knowledge was power, and power was the only currency that mattered now in the glittering, gilded cage of Fox. She filled the page, a quiet act of defiance amidst the pharmacy's hopeful hum. The notebook snapped shut. Carole slid it back into her bag, the weight of its contents heavier than the contract. She left a coin beside her empty cup and stood, smoothing her plain skirt. As she walked out of Schwab's, the afternoon sun felt less like warmth and more like interrogation. She didn't hail a cab. She walked, her steps measured, purposeful, heading not towards her bungalow, but towards a shabby brick building downtown, the address of a small, independent acting coach known for working with difficult talents. Lila wouldn't be a puppet, she'd be a weapon honed to perfection. Zanuck wanted results. She'd give him results that would sear the screen. The emerald dress had been a symbol of surrender, the role of Lila would be her battle standard. The coach's studio was cramped, smelling of dust and old paper. Marta Volkov, a woman with eyes like chipped flint, listened without expression as Carole stated her purpose: I need to find Lila's fire. Not just sing it, live it. Marta's gaze swept over her, lingering on the shadows beneath Carole's eyes, the set of her jaw. Fire burns the bearer too, girl, she rasped. But she agreed. They started immediately, not with scales or projection, but with raw, guttural sounds pulled from the pit of Carole's stomach, sounds of rage, of betrayal, of survival. Each choked cry felt like tearing a piece of the Beverly Wilshire from her soul, leaving her trembling but strangely lighter. The polished future demanded polish, she would forge herself in its crucible. Leaving Marta's studio hours later, her voice raw but her spirit strangely alight, Carole paused on the street corner. The city lights were coming on, reflecting in the puddles left by a brief rain. She saw her faint reflection in a shop window, not the hollow-eyed ghost from the morning, but a woman with purpose etched into her stance, a dangerous glint in her eyes. She touched the notebook in her bag, felt the folded contract, thought of the emerald silk hidden away. The game was indeed on. But Carole Landis was no longer just playing by Zanuck's rules, she was writing her own, line by bloody line, in the margins of his contract. She turned towards home, the walk no longer a retreat, but a march towards Monday's reckoning. Rehearsals for Nights in White Satin began in a cramped, echoing room smelling of stale coffee and nervous sweat. Heater Fulton ran a tight ship, his eyes missing nothing. Carole stood apart, absorbing Lila's sharp dialogue, her cynical worldview a stark contrast to the bubbly ingenue lead. When Fulton called her for Lila's first solo, a bitter ballad about love gone sour, the room hushed. Carole closed her eyes, summoning not just Marta's training, but the cold weight of Zanuck's hand, the tearing silk, the scent of cigar smoke. Her voice, when it came, wasn't polished perfection, it was a low, smoky growl, laced with a lifetime's disillusionment that silenced the chatter. Fulton leaned back, arms crossed, a slow, approving nod his only reaction. The technicians exchanged glances again. This wasn't just acting, it was an exorcism. Zanuck appeared unannounced one afternoon, a silent, imposing shadow at the back of the rehearsal hall. He watched Carole run a scene where Lila verbally eviscerates a naive suitor. Her delivery was ice-cold, precise, each word a shard of glass. His expression remained unreadable, but his gaze never left her. As the scene ended, he turned without a word and walked out. Later, a memo arrived at her dressing room: dinner. 8 p.m. The Brown Derby. Private booth. No signature. Just his unmistakable, heavy scrawl. The summons hung in the air, thick with implication. This wasn't about the role anymore, it was a reminder of the transaction, a demand for the next installment on her debt. Carole crumpled the note, then carefully smoothed it out, her fingers tracing the ink. The battlefield had just shifted. The night before her first on-set filming day, Carole stood before her closet. The cheap blue dress, the plain blouse and skirt, the sequined costume, and the emerald silk, hidden in its dark corner. She reached past them all, pulling out a simple, well-cut black dress she'd bought with her last paycheck. It wasn't a fox blonde's gown. It was Lila's armor. She slipped it on, the fabric cool and sober. In the mirror, the woman staring back wasn't the hopeful girl who first walked onto the Fox lot, nor the shattered creature who left the Beverly Wilshire. She was harder, sharper, a weapon forged in fire and secrecy. She picked up her bag, feeling the weight of the contract and the notebook within. Tomorrow, she would face the cameras, the crew, Zanuck's watchful eyes. But tonight, she had a dinner to attend, a performance demanding a different kind of ruthlessness. She turned off the light and stepped into the Hollywood night, ready for both. The Brown Derby's famous domed ceiling felt oppressive, not whimsical, in the dim light of the secluded booth. Zanuck sat waiting, already nursing a scotch, his expression unreadable behind a veil of cigar smoke. Carole slid in opposite him, the black dress a stark declaration against the plush red leather. He didn't compliment her. Lila's working, he stated flatly, swirling his drink. Fulton is pleased. The dailies have, bite. His eyes, cold and assessing, locked onto hers. But bite without control is just noise, Carole. Remember who provided the stage. The waiter hovered. Zanuck ordered for them both, steak, rare, no consultation. As the silence stretched, thick with the unsaid, Carole reached into her bag, not for the compact, but for a folded sheet. She slid it across the tablecloth. It was a copy of the scene scheduled for tomorrow, Lila's confrontation with the mob boss. Zanuck's eyes flicked down, then back to her face, a question hardening his features. Carole leaned forward, her voice low, deliberate. Page 3, she murmured. Lila's line, "You think you own everything. You don't own me." She paused, letting the words hang, heavy with double meaning. "I intend to deliver it looking straight into camera one." Her gaze didn't waver. "Thought you should know." Zanuck's fingers tightened around his glass. The cigar smoke seemed to coil tighter around him. He recognized the challenge, not defiance for its own sake, but a calculated thrust, using the role he'd granted as her shield and her blade. The waiter returned with their plates. Zanuck cut into his steak, the knife scraping harshly against the china. Ambitious, he finally rasped, the word clipped, devoid of warmth. He chewed slowly, watching her pick disinterestedly at her food. Ambition needs focus, he added, his gaze sharpening. Don't let the character consume you, Carole. Fox invests in assets, not liabilities. The threat was velvet-gloved, but unmistakable. Carole set her fork down with deliberate softness. She met his stare across the table, the booth's intimacy feeling like a cage. Lila isn't consumed, she stated, her voice clear, carrying a brittle edge that cut through the restaurant's murmur. She survives. By knowing exactly what the cost is. She lifted her water glass, taking a slow sip, her eyes never leaving his. Just like any smart investment. The silence that followed was charged, electric. Zanuck's jaw tightened. He saw the steel beneath the black dress, the fire she channeled not just for the cameras but against him. The polished future he dangled was becoming a double-edged sword. He signaled for the check without finishing his meal. As he scrawled his signature, Carole gathered her copy of the scene, folding it precisely back into her bag. Outside, his chauffeur waited by the sleek Cadillac. Zanuck held the door open himself, an unusual gesture. As she slid past him into the cold leather interior, his hand brushed her arm, not possessive, but a brief, assessing pressure. His voice, low and cold, reached her ear. "Make it count tomorrow, Landis." The door thudded shut. The car pulled away, leaving him standing on the curb, a silhouette swallowed by the derby's neon glow. Carole leaned back, closing her eyes. The first skirmish was over. The war, and the filming, began at dawn. The soundstage buzzed with controlled chaos, technicians adjusting Klieg lights, grips moving heavy flats, the sharp scent of fresh paint hanging in the air. Carole sat in Lila's dressing room, smaller than the leads but hers alone, applying her own makeup with steady hands. She layered on the character's world weariness, subtle shadows beneath the eyes, a slightly harder set to the mouth. The cheap blue dress hung forgotten on a hook. Lila's costume, a bias-cut satin gown the color of dried blood, lay draped across a chair. Fulton's voice crackled over the intercom, "Places for scene 14. Landis, front and center." She stood, smoothing the dark dress she'd worn to dinner, her armor beneath the costume. The set was a replica of a smoky nightclub. The mob boss actor, a veteran character player, exuded practiced menace from his chair. Camera One's lens, cold and unblinking, pointed directly at her mark. Zanuck stood just outside the pool of light, arms crossed, a silent statue of judgment. Fulton called, "Action." The scene unfolded, sharp dialogue, veiled threats. Then came her line. Carole took a slow drag on the prop cigarette, exhaling smoke like a sigh. Her eyes lifted, not to the actor opposite her, but straight into the dark eye of Camera One. "You think you own everything." Her voice was a rasp, low and dangerous. A beat. The silence stretched, taut. "You don't own me." The words hit the air like bullets, aimed beyond the mob boss, beyond the set, straight at the shadow watching from the darkness. Fulton didn't yell, "Cut." He let the silence linger, thick with the echo of her defiance. The crew froze. Zanuck's expression remained stone, but a muscle flickered in his jaw. Carole held the gaze into the lens for one more heartbeat, then slowly turned back to the scene, Lila's mask of weary cynicism sliding perfectly back into place as she delivered her next line. Only then did Fulton bark, "Cut. Print that." A murmur rippled through the crew. Zanuck turned, and walked off the stage without a word, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the concrete floor, retreating into the shadows of the studio. Carole lowered her eyes, the ghost of a hard, unyielding smile touching her lips. The performance had begun. Back in her dressing room, the adrenaline faded, leaving her hands trembling. She splashed cold water on her face, washing away Lila's makeup, revealing the pale, strained skin beneath. A knock sounded, sharp, impatient. It was Zanuck's secretary, holding a slim envelope. "Mr. Zanuck requested you receive this immediately," she stated, her tone clipped, avoiding Carole's eyes. Inside was a single sheet, a revised call sheet. Her name, Carole Landis, was boldly printed beside Lila Morgan. Below it, a handwritten note: "Satin reshoots commence Saturday. Your presence required. Suite 1204. 9 p.m. No signature. Just the chillingly familiar time and place. The polished future demanded another payment. She crumpled the paper, then carefully smoothed it flat, placing it beside the contract in her bag. The game was relentless. That evening, Carole walked past Schwab's without stopping. Instead, she headed to a pay-phone booth on a dimly lit corner. Dropping a nickel into the slot, she dialed a number memorized from her notebook, the direct line to Hedda Hopper's syndicated gossip column. When the raspy voice answered, Carole pitched her own voice low, smoky, indistinguishable. "Tip for Hedda," she murmured. "Check suite 1204 at the Beverly Wilshire Saturday night. Fox's newest investment, making a down payment." She hung up before a reply came, the receiver slick in her hand. Stepping back into the night, she felt a sliver of cold satisfaction. Zanuck wanted discretion. She'd give him headlines. Knowledge was power, and power was the only shield she had left.